everyone, Lisa here for Imagine Crafts. So today I'm going to do a quick comparison on the Memento dye inks and Memento Luxe inks. I'm going to talk about what makes them different and do a little side-by-side comparison on different types of paper. Now I have a few of the ink pads laid out here. The only difference in the packaging is the dye inks have a white lid while the Luxe inks have a clear lid. Now, the Memento dye inks line has 36 colors and the Luxe line shares 24 of those same colors. What's the difference in them? One is a dye ink and one is a pigment ink. Now, the dye ink is great for all types of paper and, of course, as we all know, the perfect ink for alcohol markers and for watercoloring. The lid on the Luxe line says for mixed media, but you can use this ink for card making and scrapbooking. This ink is archival, so it's great for projects that you are looking to preserve. So here's a quick side-by-side view of those ink pads. The visual difference is obvious with the dye ink on the left and the pigment ink on the right. Now, dye inks tend to have felt pads. The inks are usually transparent, so you will only be able to use these on white or lighter colored cardstock. And dye inks tend to dry faster. Pigment inks tend to have a very spongy pad. They are opaque when applied to paper. So unlike the dye ink, you can use these inks on darker cardstock, and pigment inks have a longer dry time, which is great for heat embossing. Next, I want to show you how these two inks compare when stamped on white and black cardstock. So I'm stamping the dye ink on the top and the pigment ink below. First up, the dye ink. Now, when I stamp this, it looks splotchy, and that's okay. It just has to get happy in its situation. Give it a few minutes, and it will start to even itself out. Now, I'm going to go ahead and stamp it one more time, and you'll notice immediately the splotchiness is all but gone. And if you're impatient like me and don't want to give that ink time to do its thing, stamp it twice. I almost always stamp twice. So next up, we're going to go ahead and stamp from the Luxe line. And you're going to notice the coverage with this pigment ink appears to be much better on the first stamped impression than we got with the dye ink. And it's just the way it is because the pigment ink sits on top of the paper, creating like a film over the paper, whereas the dye inks soak into the paper. I'm going to let you get a close-up of this so you can see the difference in the two. And then let's go ahead and do that again on black cardstock. This time we're going to start with that pigment ink. We're going to stamp the pigment ink on the bottom. I have the cardstock labeled for you. And you're going to see how this is pigment ink. It sits on top of that paper. You can see it, no problem. The dye ink here, you are not going to be able to see that at all. I'm going to give you a quick side-by-side comparison of the two, the black cardstock and the white cardstock, so you see the difference. Do a quick comparison using both types of inks to watercolor. I have two butterflies stamped onto a piece of Arches watercolor paper with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink, and I'm going to start with the dye ink, and I can tell you from past experience, Memento dye inks are amazing for watercoloring. So now the Luxe line. This is the first time I've ever used this Luxe ink for watercoloring, so let's see what happens. The ink is so creamy, and I'm actually really impressed with the results I'm getting here. You can see how that transparent that dye ink is up top, and this Luxe ink has more of what I would call a milky look to it. When you add water to it, it's very pretty, and you can still see how it's remaining opaque on that paper. So the last comparison, ink blending over a stencil. Now we already know that both of these inks are blendable, but let's see how they compare when we use them with a stencil. Quick close up there, the dye ink on the left, the Luxe on the right. Personally, I prefer stenciling with dye inks. I think the results are much better. The edges are sharper looking to me when you use the dye ink. So I want to just say real quick, thanks for joining me today. I hope you'll click the subscribe button and ring the bell to be notified of new content to this channel. Please feel free to share all the videos here with your crafty friends. Now, for more information about the products used in the video, head over to the Imagine Crafts website, and I hope you have an amazing day.